Thank you for joining us on another episode of Latter-Gay Stories podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Ashworth, and a special episode we have for you tonight. Welcome to COVID Tuesday. What are we? Almost 2 weeks into our shelter in place, our social distancing. And so we're bringing you a little bit of a social distancing episode today, and excited to have on the podcast a researcher who's started an in-depth research with some other researchers into this intersection of sexuality and reality, where religion and sexuality and identity, LDS Street meets with LGBTQ Avenue. And that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about on today's episode. If you are joining us through one of the Facebook tags that we helped to promote this episode on, I tagged it with the 4 options survey. Now, some of you might have heard of that survey somewhere along the line. About 3 years ago, the original survey was put out to help start better understanding this intersection between sexuality and reality, between the LGBTQ and LDS communities. And so this is a follow-up of phase 1 of that study, but also phase 2, which is vitally important to study the long-term outlook and the long-term study information, conclusions of this topic. So if you are just joining us, we want to welcome you. We do want to kind of make this episode more interactive than the ones that we normally have, because this is a live episode. We invite you to share your comments, your questions right here on the Facebook side, and we will kind of discuss those, because I think this is an episode that will help us to bring not only the LGBTQ, or maybe even more importantly, the LGB segment of this topic, together with the active Latter-day Saint, heterosexual family member, bishop, stake president, and maybe even more importantly, someone still identifying as same-sex attracted in a closeted situation, still heavily entrenched in the church. We're trying to bring those two communities together in this podcast episode to better understand what the research is saying, what long-term results are between those two communities, and how we can best better understand the roadmap. So without further ado, again, I'd invite you to share this podcast episode as we go along for the next hour or so. Share it on some of your LGBT-friendly pages, so we can get a decent audience and really discuss this topic. But I want to welcome to this episode of Latter-Gay Stories, Tyler Lefevor. Welcome, Tyler.
Thanks, Kyle. It's a pleasure to be here.
So kind of a rough opening. I'm in Utah. You're in Tennessee.
Tennessee, yeah. Memphis, sheltering in place.
So we do have 6 feet between us.
Or 600.
There are less than 10 gathered, so I think we're meeting all the rules, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Tyler, tell us a little bit about yourself first, and then we'll jump into the study, because I think both topics are fascinating. So tell the audience a little bit about who Tyler is and what makes him tick.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tyler Lefevor, I'm 32. I consider myself a counselor, presenter, researcher. So I've got a degree in counseling psychology, where I currently work at Rhodes College in Memphis. So I'll be starting at Utah State in the fall. So in my day job, I'm teaching courses around research methods, gender and sexuality, as well as doing research. My research focuses on the intersection of faith, gender, sexuality, and mental health. And then I do therapy. I've got a private practice in Memphis. We'll have a practice in the Salt Lake and Logan area come fall. And I'm really fascinated to understand how it is that people's identities come together and ways that promote or don't promote mental health. So I got involved so I was raised LDS, and I am not currently a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as of a couple years ago, and then I identified as queer. So I spent a lot of time working things out for myself first, which is why I'm interested. And one of my main goals is to create a better understanding around this intersection so that people can make the best decisions that they can.
So let's first maybe start with the origins of the survey. Why gay Mormons? Why this topic? And what maybe the genesis? What drove the beginning of the 4 options survey?
Yeah, so there's a group of therapists who call themselves the Reconciliation Growth Project. They meet for 2 hours every other week in Salt Lake City, and it's a group of initially of 12 therapists. I think they're up to 14 now, and they're evenly split between conservative and liberally oriented individuals. And their mission is to create understanding about best psychotherapy practices for navigating sexuality, gender, and faith. And out of some of their discussions, a couple of them, Lee Beckstead and Mary Beth Raines, started to wonder if there could be some sort of psychological study or psychometrically validated assessment that could help people make decisions about the best life path for them. So Ron and Mary Beth, over a series of conversations with the larger project, decided to start a research study. They came up with this long survey. We were, I think, close to 300 questions when we started. If you've taken the survey, it's still long, but you can be grateful it's not that long anymore. Which was designed to be a comprehensive assessment of a variety of domains that were believed to be related to sexuality, religion, and health. In this team, we brought in people from a variety of perspectives. So there's 6 of us that are the core members of this team. So Ron and Lee, there's also, Mary Beth and Lee. Ron Scow is part of this, Ty Mansfield, Christopher Rosick, and myself. And in the creation of the team, we've tried to keep a good balance of people who come from more progressive, liberal backgrounds, with people from more conservative backgrounds, with the hope that by collaborating together with people from a variety of perspectives and backgrounds, we can get closer to the truth in this issue.
And the truth is what? What is it that you're trying to, what data are you trying to find? What conclusions? I know it's hard when you talk to a researcher saying, are you researching to obtain a conclusion, or because I know that's not how it works, but so you assemble a great team together and start analyzing 4 sections of the market, of the demographics. What is it that you are trying to better hone into?
Yeah, some of our first research questions were, 2 big questions. One is there a singular relationship status that's most closely related to health, satisfaction, flourishing? So kind of which horse is the winner? If we've got 4 different horses, we'll talk about them in a second, which of them wins? And then on the other hand, what if I'm already committed? What if I'm already on a horse and I'm not interested in changing horses? If I'm committed to a life path, what can I do to be happy there? So we're trying to answer some big questions that say, what is it that people most commonly do? And then how can people be healthy and satisfied in a variety of these options?
And yeah, I get this. So you brought up the horse. So you already have my attention.
Yeah. So we're talking about 4 singular relationship status options. So these are single and celibate, single but not celibate, mixed orientation relationship, and same-sex relationships. And most of them are what they sound. A mixed orientation relationship is one where one partner is heterosexual or straight, and the other partner is same-sex attracted, gay, lesbian, bisexual, any of the above, and the LGBTQ family. And then same-sex relationship is as it sounds. So we're interested in, is there a single relationship status that is most closely tied to health? And then how do we flourish in each of them? Shall I cut to the chase, Kyle? Should we talk about what we found?
Yeah, let's dig into it, because I think this is where the audience is going to be most interested as we break down each of those categories, because someone of the audience that we have, they're going to fit somewhere in that category. And so I think this is a good opportunity to say, here's what the research has said. Often on this podcast, we talk about real lived experiences. Yeah. How, on one hand, the church in particular, and we're going to talk a lot about that in this episode, because we are comparing, we are literally talking about a study that's studying Mormons who have an intersection with the LGBTQ spectrum somewhere. So I think that's a given for the people who are paying attention to this episode right now. As we discuss that, I think someone somewhere along in our viewer or listenership now is going to find themselves in one of those categories, or intimately involved, friend, ally, mother, father, church leader, with someone there as well. So as we break them down, I think people would be interested in that. And if you who are listening or watching wants to make a comment about each of those, let's have a discussion and maybe ask some questions. And that'll give you, Tyler, an opportunity to maybe better help them understand that experience as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, we can go down into it. And I also want to put out that I hope, as a researcher, I'm always looking for feedback. So I hope that in addition to commenting, that you'll reach out to me with other comments or questions that you might have. You can find my name and email if you Google me, dr.tyler.Lefevor. So let me tell you a little bit about who took the survey before I go down into the categories. So I'm going to present some data from this first, from phase 1, which we collected about 3 years ago. Right around election time. So we like to collect our data when presidents are getting elected, or maybe when President Trump is up for office, as we might say. We had almost 1,500 respondents who identified as Mormon. There was a larger sample who were from other religious backgrounds. I'm going to kind of blur the lines a bit. Some of the analysis were with one, some with the other sample. And of them, our participants came from all, or most of the 50 states. The majority of the participants were from the Western United States, lived in cities, tended to be pretty well educated, somewhere between a bachelor's and master's degree. And most of the people in our study were between 18 and 40, though we had maybe 30% of our sample who were older than 40. Mostly white, mostly male. So some limitations, but given that this was our first attempt to understand what we could understand about these statuses. So I want to walk you through a couple of our main findings. The first is which horse wins. So if we've got these 4 singular relationship statuses, which we can kind of divide on an axis based on whether they're conservative or liberal, right? So there's 2 conservative approaches, being single and celibate, or being in a mixed orientation relationship. Through the past, many people who are raised Mormon say, I'm going to do one or the other, because anything else is going to be breaking away from my Mormon tradition. Then we have 2 liberal approaches. We have single but not celibate, who are typically dating people of the same sex, and people in same-sex relationships. The first, we looked at 5 different kinds of outcomes. We looked at satisfaction with their status. So do you like being where you're at? We looked at anxiety. We looked at depression. We looked at life satisfaction. And then we looked at flourishing. So the last 2 being more positive aspects of happiness. So it's not just, are you depressed? What is it? Are you enjoying your life? And what was interesting is that we found that all 5 outcomes seemed to behave similarly. So if someone was high on one, they tended to be high on the others, and then low in the mental health outcomes. So the first question we asked are, which horse wins? And it found that they ranked 1, 2, 3, 4. So people in same-sex relationships tended to be the happiest, the most satisfied, followed by people in mixed orientation relationships, followed by our 2 single groups. There weren't really any differences between the people who were single and celibate versus the people who were single but not. And then if you broke it down and looked a little bit more closely, there was a small gap between the same-sex relationship and mixed orientation relationship individuals, and then a large gap between people in a relationship and people who are single in terms of anxiety, depression, satisfaction, and health more broadly.
Were there certain indicators that helped to define why there was such a gap?
Yeah, we looked a little bit more. We tried to figure out what was responsible for this, and a lot of it has been guesswork on the back end, right? So noticing that people who were coupled tended to be less depressed and happier than people who were single. I think it says something about the importance of having a partner. In some of our follow-up analyses, we also looked at which variables predicted satisfaction apart from singular relationship status. And the thing that was most closely related to any of our health variables was meeting needs for connection, intimacy, and mutual understanding. So one of our dominant hypotheses is that people who are most satisfied meet their needs for connection the best, and people in relationships tend to do a better job of meeting those needs than people who are single. What was interesting to us was that about over half of people in our same-sex and mixed orientation relationships were satisfied. I think it was 90% of people in same-sex relationships and something like 85% or 80% of people in mixed orientation relationships. But it was only about half of the people who were single who said that they were satisfied with their status. There's some pretty big differences with people who are single really seeming to be searching, or either searching for a relationship or saying, I'm not sure if this is a long-term strategy for me.
So how do those lines divide between single and celibate and single but still dating or looking?
Yeah, they didn't in our study, at least. We didn't find very many meaningful differences in terms of health. We did when we look. So the next thing we did is said, okay, what if you're already committed, right? So I'm already committed to one of these four. So what can I do to be healthy or happy in these four? And we did find differences between the people who are single and celibate or single and not celibate in that. Let me run through just some of the things that tended to be important for people to be satisfied in the past that they were.
Yeah, and while I think it's interesting being in this space as we discuss this topic. Often kind of the blanket rhetoric is that mixed orientation marriages are awful. That none of them survive, or a very small number of them survive, that celibacy is Satan's stepsister. So that's even more awful. So I think that's the important part of this study. And it's one thing to glean information based on a limited number of responses, but maybe unfolding this into a larger audience gives us a better understanding as to how this actually works. And maybe we'll get to that at the tail end of this episode, how important it is to get this data from a wide variety of different people. But I think that would be important for the listeners to understand and maybe better understand, because not everybody experiences an awful mixed orientation marriage. Not everybody thinks celibacy is the worst. But on the other, playing devil's advocate, or on the other shoe, there are substantial cases of mixed orientation marriages being difficult and not sustainable, and lives of celibacy being difficult and not sustainable.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest limitations of this study is that we weren't able to follow people over time. So someone could say or be happy in one of these statuses and then change in a year or two. And so one of the things that we're looking to do going forward, which we'll talk about more at the end, is to do longitudinal follow-up of people to see if people who commit to lives of celibacy actually continue with them, and the same thing with other statuses. But yeah, Kyle, you're right. I'm really interested in understanding why people can't, or how is it that people can be happy in each of these. So I think, at least what the data seems to say, that when people were celibate, it was particularly important that they met needs for connection, which makes sense. If you're celibate and you're not having a sexual or probably romantic partnership, then you're going to need to have connection, probably more than in any other status. Three other things actually that were really important for people who were celibate were being resolved religiously. So meaning that they felt that their celibacy was an active choice and was in line with their values, rather than a passive choice of like, I'm not sure what to do, so I guess I'm celibate. And I think that speaks to some of the atrocity or not that people can have and find meaning in celibacy when it feels ego-syntonic to them, when it seems like what they want to do. Similarly, in our study, we found that when celibate individuals saw masturbation as acceptable, they tended to be less satisfied, which was not what I expected.
Say that again, because I think that's interesting.
Yeah, so when celibate people saw masturbation as okay, they tended to be less satisfied with being celibate, and more depressed, and less satisfied with their life overall. Which I think is because if you're committing to celibacy, you're probably committing to celibacy from a religious framework. And so if you're saying I'm holding this religious framework and then I'm masturbating, which at least in Mormonism is not okay, in a lot of spaces at least, then you're kind of questioning the whole purpose for your celibacy. Yeah,
and I think that's important because when I talk about this topic, I try to use the metaphor, the two sides of the aisle. On one side, you have an ultra religious society that says if you venture to the other side of the aisle, you will see a lack of spiritual experiences, decrease of happiness, all of the problems of the world will befall you. When people migrate to that other side of the aisle and they don't realize those problems or the lack of experience, the lack of happiness, the lack of spiritual experiences and those things, then it was, did I just waste a certain period of my life believing something that wasn't as accurate as it was taught to me? And so I can understand that people who give in or now participate, and when you brought it up with masturbation, they get to that point where they say, wow, I still feel like the same person. I still feel like I have spiritual experiences and forms of happiness. Did I just give a certain portion of my life away? It makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. And in one of the other studies we did from these data, we looked at how attending religious services were related to depression or any of the health measures. And we found that when people were either really involved or really not involved religiously, they were fine. But if they were somewhere in the middle, they weren't good. So it was interesting. We saw people who were really active would go every week, or more than that, were really active in their callings, had the same mental health as the people who never went. But then the people who would go maybe once or twice a month, they actually had the worst health of all of our groups. So it really kind of reinforces your aisle metaphor, right? Of this, people seem to find themselves on one end or the other and seem to be able to be happy on both ends. At least that's what they're telling us in the survey. But when they're trying to cross the aisle, they seem to really struggle.
In my experience, there aren't a lot of people who are walking in the aisle looking for a seat on either side. It's often that they stay on one side and they find comfort in that because it's all they know. When they're able to cross the aisle and go to the other side, cross the walkway and go to the other side, it's interesting, and this is just my own empirical data based on the interviews and the opportunities that I've had to talk with LGBTQ people in this space. But it's interesting that they now have an ability to see what both sides of the aisle look like. For a large portion of their life, they were experiencing only one side of the aisle, and now they have two, and that has given them a better opportunity to judge this topic. But more importantly, they look over to the people who religiously taught them what one side of the aisle looked like as opposed to the other, and they feel a little at a disadvantage because they realize that someone who hasn't seen that other side of the aisle is telling them what the other side of the aisle looks like, and that isn't their lived experience. So it's an interesting dichotomy, especially in Mormonism.
Absolutely. And we didn't get to ask people who switched, which is why we need you to participate in our next wave of studies so we can understand what happens as people move across the aisle. But we did look at differences between people who are single and celibate and people who are single but not celibate. And they were similar in a lot of ways, but the people who were single but not celibate tended to experience more same-sex attraction and to have eroticism be more important to them, which was one takeaway that, as a therapist, is important for me to share with clients, but I think is also helpful for any of you listening out there, is that people who commit to lives of celibacy, feeling like eroticism is not important, is an important boon. It helps with a life of celibacy, where someone who experiences a stronger sense of same-sex attraction and a stronger degree of attraction may struggle more committing to a life of celibacy. People who are single but not celibate also tended to flourish when they met their needs for connection and when they felt like they could express their sexuality in a way that was best for them. So we asked that question really broadly because we wanted to say that there's not a right way to express your sexuality. I could express my sexuality in a mixed orientation relationship and say having sex with my other sex partner is a good, authentic expression of my sexuality, or I could have sex with lots of people or nobody, and all of them could be authentic. But we found in particular for people who are single but not celibate that finding that balance of what an authentic expression of sexuality is was really important to them being satisfied as someone who is single but not celibate.
Oh, fascinating. As you're describing that, I'm thinking of just faces and stories and experiences. I just flash through and say, yeah, that's that person, that's this person, that's that person. Interesting,
Yeah.
just interesting information.
Yeah. I'm happy. Hopefully, I'm hoping this connects to people's lived experiences. That's at least what they told us. And one more caveat before I keep going down with the results is that this isn't going to represent everyone's experience, right? You might be listening to this and saying, well, that's not me. I'm making this work, and that's not what you're saying doesn't fit me. And that's okay. Some of this won't fit for everybody, but these are the broad trends that we're noticing. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about mixed orientation relationships. That's good. Because there's a lot of controversy about whether mixed orientation relationship can be healthy or satisfying or sustainable. I think really on both ends. Like you were saying, Kyle, there are a lot of messages that you should be in a mixed orientation relationship if you're in the LDS church, that's the way to achieve exaltation. And then on the other hand, many in the LGBTQ community would say, why would you do that to yourself? That's only going to fail and lead to more heartbreak in the end. So we're really interested in what is it when a mixed orientation relationship is appearing to be succeeding, meaning that both partners are not depressed and anxious and saying, I'm happy with my life. What is it that's linked to that? I think we found 5 or 6 variables that were related to that. The first being meeting needs for connection again. Some unique ones, though, were sexual attraction. People in mixed orientation relationships who say that they're the happiest tend to experience more other sex attraction than people in any other status. And so that counters a lot of narratives, right? It's not everyone can make this work. If you need to have some degree of other sex attraction for a mixed orientation relationship to feel sustainable.
So let's break this down into maybe some very basic layman terms in terms of the
sure.
Kinsey scale, because I think that's maybe a topic that people are more familiar with. There's varying degrees of sexuality. Now, Kinsey believed that sexuality could be measured on a sliding scale that also was more fluid, that at some point you could be, and this is a scale between 0 and 6. 0 being heterosexual, 6 being homosexual, and the ability to slide back and forth in that scale a little bit to become slightly more attracted, slightly less attractive as attractions happen. So you're saying, as part of your study, you found that the mixed orientation marriages that worked were maybe a Kinsey scale 2, 3, 4, or where do we, on this sliding scale or a scale of 0 to 6, the most successful mixed orientation relationships were where? Sure.
So a lot of the differences that we saw were actually pretty small. So on average, people in mixed orientation relationships were a Kinsey 4, which contrasts with people in same-sex relationships who are a Kinsey 5. So we're not looking at big differences statistically, but there's a range, and I suppose our findings would suggest that people who were lower than a 4 tended to have more satisfying relationships. So Kinsey 3s or 2s would probably be much more satisfied. So 3 or 2, 3 being the midpoint, right? So equal attraction both ways, and 2 being a little bit more heterosexual than same sex. But most of the people in mixed orientation relationships were still saying, I'm predominantly same-sex oriented, but have some degree of same-sex attraction.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah. So in addition, people in mixed orientation relationships that tended to be happy were also resolved religiously and also didn't masturbate. Same in a similar fashion to the people who were celibate, which I think again speaks to this idea that if I'm in a mixed orientation relationship, it's important that I'm committed to my worldview, that I have made this decision volitionally and that it represents my values. I think one of the trappings that we can get into when we're talking about this is suggesting that any of these 4 statuses could be good for any person. I don't think that's true at all. I don't think any of us can really tell anyone else where they should be, particularly because the data seem to say that feeling like you're in the option that's best for you is going to be predictive of how well you succeed in that option.
I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah. The last bit, so we went single and celibate, single not celibate, mixed orientation. People in same-sex relationships who generally reported being more satisfied and happy. But there were also, even in the same-sex relationship group, people who were happier and not in their relationships. And what we found was that there were only two variables that really predicted this. The first was, again, meeting needs for connection. This just came up over and over again. No matter what you're doing, it's important that you are meeting needs for connection. If you're doing that, then you're going to be less depressed, less anxious, and more satisfied. But the other one was sexual expression. So feeling like they're expressing their sexuality in a way that's best or most egocentric to them. So being in a same-sex relationship, many people would make that transition because they're wanting to have a more sexually fulfilled life. And so finding that fulfillment is actually pretty important for satisfaction in a same-sex relationship.
Okay, while we're on the topic of satisfaction, I just got one question in on the Latter-day Stories contact side of it, on the website side. So I'm an active Latter-day Saint, and I fall into a Kinsey 4. And as I'm listening to you talk about this, I think about my family and the church, who continues to tell me that I should just try to be 100% straight because I am a Kinsey 4. But I don't feel I would be honest with my future spouse. Is there research that includes regret for choices? And I like that phrase. Like getting married to a woman and then failing at it.
Oh, what a great question. I wish I had research data on that. Maybe with this longitudinal section I will. But there is research on authenticity, which suggests that people, when they're authentic, are happier. And so if anyone's telling you that you should hide part of your identity, that's probably not going to be related to, or not going to be a happy choice. So being able to express where you're at, I think, is going to be important to be happy wherever you are. And then the second, I was just in a meeting with a client a couple of hours ago, where we talked about these same kinds of themes. And I think for a lot of people, people do experience regret and make choices that they wish they hadn't made, but that regret leads them to make new choices or repair their lives. I think people overestimate the role that regret will play in their life and forget that if they make a choice they're not happy with, that they're able to return to their previous choice.
Yeah, I think that's a fair answer. Another question, and this is maybe along the lines, but this is now taking more of the intersection of religion and sexuality. What can groups like North Star, Jonah, and other faith-based institutions, especially like the church, who promote celibacy-driven models, glean from research like this?
Yeah, I think the first is that celibacy is a really difficult path. That I guess I can't say most, but about half of the people who are attempting celibacy are not satisfied with being celibate. And when I share this as a therapist, I tell people, I'm like, look, the research says there's 4 options. Here's how they stack up. You can pick any one you want, but people are tending to be less satisfied.
And I think this question is coming from not just an overall I'll be single and celibate, but is celibacy the better choice as opposed to a mixed orientation relationship? I'm getting that's the direction, just the previous parts of this question. That is it smarter for me just to suck it up, bury it, turn it off like a light switch, and be celibate, as opposed to risking, and maybe I'll add in my own part of this question, because I like to call this collateral damage. You get married, and now it's not just your problem, but it's now yours and your spouse's, especially if you married closeted and didn't disclose that to your spouse. And then you have children, and then you build a family, and you build structure and infrastructure. And at the end of the day, you look back and you've built this huge house of cards, and you don't know how to reverse. You don't know how to get out from underneath that. So then you feel stuck. So I think this question is now saying, is there something we can learn from your mixed orientation relationship studies that helps prevent collateral damage? And is that celibacy just the best option?
Oh gosh, that's a really complicated question, Kyle. I don't have a straightforward answer. I'm just gonna give you that, but let me talk around it a little bit. So I think that authenticity, being authentic about wherever you are, is going to be most closely related to health. So if you are entering a mixed orientation relationship, to be able to be authentic about attraction, whatever attractions you're having, is going to be important. And I can see some value in saying, look, I don't want to commit myself to this kind of life if I'm not sure. I think that could be a wise choice. At the same time, we find that people, when they're partnered, tend to do better than when they're single. So I would never encourage someone to go after a relationship that doesn't feel authentic for them. But what I would encourage clients to do is to look for relationships that are authentic, whether they're sexual or not. And I think that there could be a whole variety of ways around this, because it feels like either I'm single and celibate or in a mixed orientation relationship, but perhaps you have a network of support of people, both same and other sex, who are able to meet some of your needs for connection, so it doesn't feel like such an isolated life.
And just to jump back a little bit, Matt says,
Alexa, turn on house light.
Matt's asking connection. So he wants to go through your list again. Connection, some attraction, committed to worldview, sexual expression, and what were the other two?
Oh gosh, for which of our group?
I think we're talking about mixed orientation relationships.
Okay.
You brought up connection, some attraction, committed to a worldview, sexual expressions, and then you listed two other ones.
Being resolved religiously, which is part of being committed to a worldview. And that I kind of combined masturbation and resolved religiously in the committed to a worldview. I think that's what he was missing.
Gotcha. I think that's right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Alexa, for turning on the lights.
Yeah, I muted my speaker rather than my microphone when I said that.
Okay. So overall, now you said that you didn't receive in this study a lot of data on mixed orientation relationships. Most were same-sex relationships and single celibate. Was that right?
We had a good chunk in each. We weren't able to follow them, but we had maybe 250 people in mixed orientation relationships.
Of the 1,500 respondents.
Yeah. So we're really concerned about always getting people in mixed orientation relationships or who are celibate in our research, because they tend to be more closeted and less likely to come to even a North Star conference.
Let's talk about that. That's actually that's a part of this interview that I wanted to venture down, because even within Mormonism, we have these Kinsey scales, this degree of religious commitment. North Star is the type of group that, well, according to their bylaws, they wholly support the doctrine and teachings of the church. So you have a very orthodox, conservative view on this topic. How does your research speak to them? And let's hit that group first. Let's first talk about a North Star group, or active Latter-day Saint who fears deviation from the covenant path.
Yeah. So I think that the research suggests that people can find satisfaction in this group. I think from my own experiences, a lot of people tend to come to North Star as their first way of getting engaged with the LGBTQ community, which is important. I think being authentic and feeling supported in one's sexuality is important regardless of the life path. And for many people, North Star is the only way to find that support.
I like to call it the soft landing. It's a perfect place for people to, and there's a large number of people who are listening to this podcast or watching this episode who are in this space. They're still actively ingrained in the church, often closeted, and they're reaching out to people who are like them. They're trying to find their herd. And North Star is that safe spot that allows them to still be Mormon, still be very Latter-day Saint, maybe just dip their toes into the water a little bit and not feel like they're sacrificing anything. And it is a soft landing. It's an opportunity for them to come out and to see what that world looks like a little bit, even if they have to retreat back in.
Yeah, and I think I would want to say that it's important to have that soft landing if you're not there yet, if you haven't shared with anybody. Having people that you can talk to about sexuality and your faith is an important first step. In the therapy that I do, I tell people that I want you to have someone on team you, someone who's not committed or who doesn't care what kind of life path decision you have, but just is committed to your happiness and is going to understand these different parts of your identity. And I think a lot of people find that in North Star.
So back to the original question, what do groups like North Star, the participants in North Star, glean from this first phase of the study? And then how can they better help you on phase 2?
Great. So I think a couple things. So they glean that there can be satisfaction and that many people don't find satisfaction in these more conservative relationship options. And that's okay. People are just going to make the decisions that they're going to make. One of the most interesting findings from these data were that people who identify as same-sex attracted and people who identify as LGBTQ tend to have similar mental health. So the labels themselves don't seem to relate to mental health. They kind of connote different worldviews. So if I say I'm same-sex attracted, what I'm really telling you is that I'm Mormon, Christian, I'm religious first, and sexual minority second. And if I say that I'm LGBTQ, I'm typically conveying that I'm a sexual minority first and that I'm religious second. At least that was kind of what our data showed. So I think the research creates some space for people to exist in a North Star space and say, like, this can be a satisfying way not only for right now, but for a longer term, possible. Some people move. And then to your second question, Kyle, I appreciate you asking. So we're kicking off a second round of data collection, and we really are looking to collect the experiences of people from these more conservative relationship options, because we have so many people coming forward with their experiences in same-sex relationships or who are single but not celibate, but fewer people coming forward about being in a mixed orientation relationship or single and celibate, that in order for us to do justice to the full range of experiences, we particularly need people from North Star and groups like it to take part of the study.
Another question just came in that kind of goes along with that. In your study, can you talk about how beneficial support for decisions, both for or against these relationships, can be? Were you able to?
So how beneficial support for these decisions, whether for or against relationships, can be?
Yeah, I think what the question is, the way I interpret the question is, was there evidence that came out of the study that says I can support you exactly where you're at right now today, and that support, whether it's for or against a relationship, is beneficial to that individual person, that person who's in somewhere along that spectrum? Was there something in your study that said avoiding the topic, not addressing it, not acknowledging it was more harmful than supporting whether or not they wanted to remain single and celibate or in a mixed orientation relationship or same-sex relationship? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. Let me tell you the data that I've got for sure, and then I'll extrapolate a little bit. So we looked at a smaller sample of our group that identified as LGBTQ. That's a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer. And we were looking at things that were related to their health overall and found that identity affirmation of their sexual identity was one of the strongest predictors for their health. And that's exactly what you're saying, Kyle. It's that when people have support around their sexuality, that say that this is a space that I can bring my sexuality, that you can hear about my experiences with dating or not, having safe spaces like that are crucial for my overall well-being, regardless of what life path I'm in. And really, actually, regardless of what the beliefs or preferences of the support individual were. And kind of to extrapolate, what I take away from it is that having people to talk to about your sexuality is the most important thing. And people who support will supportively listen without having a vested interest in you doing any of these life paths. And some of those people, that's going to mean that maybe you're not going to be talking to your other sex partner about this because they have a vested interest in the path you choose. Maybe it's not going to be your parent or your child because they probably also have a vested interest in the life path you choose. Maybe it's going to be a friend or a therapist or someone else who is able to just see you and really interact with you in the same way, regardless of what you do.
I think that's why we see such an important role in online communities. Saints building bridges, affirmation, North Star that you brought up, these groups that allow the herd, this herd mentality, people the opportunity to find their herd, join together and share commonality.
Absolutely. I'm glad that we have online communities for people to connect. I think that are particularly important as people are just starting to come out and to wonder, to ask, where do I fit? Hearing the stories and getting support from others is pretty crucial in making decisions.
In the last, because I know we don't have a lot of time, on the last part of this interview, this podcast episode, I want to talk, maybe let's gear our conversation towards the church leaders, and maybe even parents. What can we talk about? What can we glean from your study, both phase 1 and the upcoming part of the study, that they can take away from this? What message as a researcher do you have for that group?
Thanks. I'm going to start with a shameless plug first, and then I'll go to what we can take away. But we need more people. And as a parent or church leader, you might have connections to people who I would never be able to reach, or who wouldn't be able to be reached through these affirmation or North Star groups. So you can tell about our survey. So www.4optionssurvey.com. Send them there. But
and that's the number 4.
Thank you. Yes, the number 4 options survey. So there's actually 2 S's in the middle that both need to be there as well. 4optionssurvey.com. And
I'll throw a link. There's a link in the description as well, so you can click through that and find that pretty easily.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. But in terms of messages to either church leaders or parents, there are a handful. I think the first is that there are 4 options, and that it's important for all people who are involved to acknowledge and validate that there are at least 4 different ways. And I've had people come and say, look, here's number 5 or 6 or 7, and yes, there are more than 4. But church leaders and parents need to be aware that there are different ways that people navigate this, and that not everyone will navigate it the same way. They also, I think as a church leader or parent, it's important to understand that people will often switch between these, and that having the flexibility to try things out is an important part of finding the option that works best for them. So some people will commit to lives of celibacy, will stay within the LDS church for their lives, and will be happy. A lot of people won't. But the people who seem to be most unhappy are the people who are stuck in a box, who feel like the only way for me to be happy is if I do X. And so providing a space as a church leader or a parent to suggest that, hey, why don't you think about the multiple options, I think is a pretty important thing to do to help someone to start to understand what could be best for them.
I like it. I think the overall theme, and I won't speak for your research, but for what I've been able to do in the podcast as well, is having an open conversation, just starting this conversation and getting to a point where we can actually discuss hard things.
Absolutely. Yeah, we need to talk about it. And we need to talk about it without any sort of prejudgment about what the outcome should be. And really, that's for everybody. Even often this message is given to church leaders or parents saying, like, stop forcing religion on your kids. But I think it's also important for people on the political left to say, hey, let people over here be. If they want to change, they will change. If they don't, they won't. So let people find their own path.
All right. Again, the website, if people want to jump onto this survey, www.4options survey.com.
Yes.
Got it right? Kyle.
Got it right.
Yeah, I do think it's important that we flood the opportunities, flood these groups with that link to give people the opportunity to participate, because the research is really fascinating, and I think it helps. I mean, we could probably spend an hour looking at the way religion has dissected this issue and comparing inaccurate truths and archaic rhetoric to real lived experiences, personal revelation, and scientific data. And we're going to find that we're miles off in terms of what the actual findings are. But we can't get there, and we can't have a valid conversation unless people are willing to step up and share their story. Unless I'm crazy.
Absolutely. No. And I think that the truth through the stories that are shared are only going to be to everybody's benefit, which is why I think having as many people take the survey as possible is going to be important, because with more people, it means we're more likely to represent everybody's voices, so that collectively as a community, we can understand what happens and when things can work, what makes them work, when things don't work, what makes them work. I just think that we owe it to ourselves as a community of LDS and former LDS individuals, some of whom are sexual minorities, some of whom are not. We owe it to ourselves to know what's going on and what the best and healthiest life practices tend to be.
Yeah, Adrian just asked what I meant by using the word change. Whole nother podcast episode. But the reality of that is that if you study Mormon history in terms of LGBTQ topics and how the church has dissected this over the years, there's been an incredible amount of change. I mean, just to make a short story long, there was a time in the church where the mandate was just that God, if the saints were faithful enough, would murder or kill the homosexuals from Zion, and that was the easiest remedy. The church softened. They got to a point where even just being homosexuals was grounds for being kicked out of the church or discrimination. And then the homosexual act, not the homosexual, and then love. And so there's been series of change throughout the history of the church. My version of change really just gets us to the point where we can maybe have the Martin Luther King vision, not being judged by the color of our skin, the content of our character, or the orientation of our sexuality. That we see this topic as normal, as we see left-handed people with red hair, blonde hair, brown hair, black hair. It just doesn't faze us anymore. That's the change that I think many of us are looking for.
I agree, and I hope we can get to a place that it can just be something that we can talk about, that people don't feel shame for experiencing, and will be able to talk about in church, at home, at work, wherever they are.
Yeah, so Adrian jumped back on and said, Tyler had said, if you want to change, you do that, implying that it was your orientation that can change.
Oh, no, not your orientation. No. I was meaning between 4 option statuses. We know that people change their single and relationship status throughout their lives. So they'll go from being single to celibate, to single but not celibate. Well, we do know that some people's sexual orientation changes, but what we found is that it's rarely self-directed, that people are not really able to change it because they want it to change. Some people, as they get older, have more or less attraction to whom they're attracted to shifts, but we don't really have any research that suggests that people can make changes in their orientation.
Contrary to popular belief and messages that come from special witnesses of Christ, sexuality is pretty fixed.
Yes, it really seems to be.
All right. The floor is yours, Tyler. What haven't we talked about? What did you want to talk about in the last few minutes? What do you want to cover?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I could wrap up with one message, it's really around inclusion and acceptance for all, and in a really thoroughgoing way that I think challenges all of us to be our most inclusive and accepting. So I think that the research that we've done on our team has suggested that people can be satisfied and happy in each of the 4 sexual identity relationship options, which can be a really difficult truth for most of us to sit with. Most of us would like to say that whatever of the 4 that we sit in, if we are in one of the 4, is the best of the 4. And I think that we owe it to each other to stop proselytizing our beliefs about what is the best way to live, I think we can share our experiences about the best ways for us to live, and we should. But I think we need to stop trying to change people's identity status, relationship status, not their orientation. And I come to appreciate the diversity within our community, that people are in different parts of their journey. People are making different choices, and that across these groups, across liberal political divides, North Star, affirmation, church leader, parent, sexual minority, LDS, ex-Mormon, that we actually have a lot more in common than not. And so the more that we can accept and appreciate that, the more space we'll give for people to live authentically in the way that's best for them.
I like it. So once again, how do we find the study? How important is it that members of those, and maybe go through those 4 categories one last time, the 4 groups that you're really trying to target. If you fall in that group, please take the study. Spend a few minutes to go through that and help develop better understanding on this topic.
Yeah, thanks. So we are wanting to follow people for the next 10 years to understand how their sexuality and religious experiences change over time. And so we need as many people as we can across 4 sexual identity relationship options. And we're looking for people who have been baptized to LDS at some point in their life. So whether you're baptized at 8, 15, 25, whether you are currently Mormon or not, just having been baptized, and then having experienced same-sex attraction at some point in their life. So 4 statuses: people who are single and celibate, single but not celibate, mixed orientation relationships, meaning one partner is a sexual minority and the other is straight, and people in same-sex relationships. You can find the link to the survey at our website, www.4optionssurvey.com, and that's the number 4 options survey. We can compensate you. We'll give you $10. It's going to take you 45 minutes or so to fill out our survey, so we are happy to compensate you for that time. But please take this, share about it with people you know who could qualify, because the more voices that we have, the closer we're going to get at the actual things that are happening in our communities.
Perfect. And then Matt just has a quick question before we wrap up. Any information within your first phase of the study that deals specifically with open mixed orientation relationships? Oh, no, but yes, but no. So there is information. We haven't analyzed it because we need more people to help write. So if that's you, come help us write. And a teaser is that as I've looked at the data for the second phase of the study, we found that about 1/3 of our participants are in open mixed orientation relationships. And actually, it's the same for same-sex relationships. 1/3 of our people in relationships are in open relationships. No idea what that means or how it's related to satisfaction, but coming soon, hopefully. And I really like the no, but maybe no, maybe what. That sounds so Mormon, so you haven't lost all your roots.
Absolutely.
Tyler Lefevor, thank you for the hour, for giving us a little bit of understanding into this study. I think it's monumental, it's important, and it's a game changer for the intersection of LGBTQ Avenue and LDS Street for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kyle. Thanks for inviting me on and for the chance to share what we found.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Thank you. You too.
This is another episode of Latter-day Stories podcast, where we do discuss this intersection of sexuality and reality, where it meets at LDS Street and LGBTQ Avenue. Again, if you want to better understand what the first phase of this topic looked like, you are welcome to visit the website at 4optionssurvey.com. That's the number 4 options with an S. survey.com, and they have some of that data right there on the website where you can read through phase 1, but most importantly, it's your opportunity to take the second part of the survey and go through that. And as Tyler mentioned, they will kick you a little bit of compensation if you are willing to take the survey. So I think it is fascinating to find out exactly what these researchers are able to find. A few of these guys, or in fact, everyone on this research team is very well involved in this topic. Mary Beth Rains, Ron Scow with Idaho State University, Ty Mansfield, and then also Tyler Lefevor with Rhodes College. And then he is moving here to Utah, just a little bit of a plug teaser for those up in the Logan area, where he will be transferring to Utah State University, and I believe a professor position in the psychology department. So lots of great data here. Thank you for spending the hour with us, and kind of dissecting this information as we looked at those different classifications of sexuality within Mormonism, and how the actual real lived experiences are playing out, not necessarily as an apostle or a prophet or a general authority laid it out, but the real lived experiences of the LGBTQ community. That is the important part of the study, that it's no longer relying on what maybe 50 North Temple tells you that homosexuality or bisexuality or lesbianism looks like, but it's the actual experiences of those people who experience their life on the spectrum. So again, we invite you to take a few minutes, 45 minutes to an hour of your time, and fill out that survey. I know it does sound daunting, but it is a good opportunity to mine this data and really contribute to a good cause. The number 4 optionssurvey.com. Again, thank you for spending an hour with us. We invite you to share this episode, maybe jot a few comments down as well to help us spread this message a little bit further into those areas that those closeted, very religious, still tied community of the LGBT community still exists. As Tyler mentioned earlier in the podcast, that is the group that he's really interested in trying to discuss this topic with. Again, thank you. Latter-Gay Stories podcast. This episode is available on the audio side, everywhere you find your favorite podcast, the video side on Facebook and YouTube. We invite you to share your comments, questions below as well, and we'll try to get back to you as quickly as we can now that this live video is ending. But again, the Latter-Gay Stories podcast is your opportunity to better understand this intersection of sexuality and reality, but most importantly, it's where you can continue writing your Latter-Gay story.